Like Ian said, I work with Pronghorn Athletics. I also work with ASDC and their partnership with High Performance. And I'm happy tonight to talk to everybody about training athletes in the weight room. So the presentation is geared towards training predominantly in the weight room. I'm going to try to make it applicable to both high school athletes, and then of course, we train mostly varsity athletes here in our gym. So making it applicable to both populations. So a quick overview kind of what tonight's going to look like for you. We're going to look at the framework in which a lot of this is pulled from. So we're going to understand what the Canadian long-term athlete development framework is and kind of how it's used from, say, infants through child, adolescence, and then of course up until adulthood. And we're going to understand quickly, I'm going to take you through kind of the framework, and we'll talk about each phase and kind of how that sets the stage for how we should be training these athletes, understanding where athletes are at in their development. And we want to use it as a tool to kind of understand how we are going to implement activity into the athletes. So throughout the presentation, like I said, we're going to quickly go through the framework so that you know where the rest of the presentation is on. And I think this is a topic that could probably go for 4 hours, so I will try to pick the highlights in which we're going to talk about. But one of the things to point out that you'll notice is we talk about the year-long athlete. So in varsity sports, predominantly athletes will train for one sport. Typically only one sport. Sometimes we see athletes train for more than one. They might train for soccer and they also might train for track and field. But in high school, we typically see athletes train for maybe 5, 6 sports. So they might just play every sport possible. And so when we look at how the LTAD framework helps us understand development, it'll help us understand how we take those athletes when they're maybe training across multitude of seasons. So they might be in season for one sport, they might not have specialized, which we hope they haven't. We hope they play multi-sports. So we kind of want to know who they are and how we can help enhance their athletic career and longevity. And that's the biggest thing I want to point out tonight is obviously, you know, we in the weight room as strength coaches, we are there to help and collaborate with coaches. So we're going to look at the needs of the athletes. Obviously, we're going to look at the needs of the sport in which they're playing. That's really, you know, important for us as strength coaches to understand. At the high school level, the coaches might be doing all of it, so they might not have a strength coach, but if you do, we'll talk about how to collaborate and mesh the two worlds together. We also will look at a brief program design. I think that could be its own presentation on itself, but I'm going to kind of look at what we control in the weight room in terms of programming and how the components of a program matter depending on the sport and if they're in season, out of season, etc. So as I move through though, I have encouraged Ian to stop me if there are questions. So if you have a question about a slide, please stop, ask the question right away. You don't always have to wait till the end, and I'll try my best to answer any questions that we have. So to get into the LTAD model, so this is the image, and I'm gonna kind of flip through the slides and we're gonna talk about each section that we see here, and I've placed the link. There's tons of information. This framework has evolved. So there's been many inputs and there's been many changes that have happened, but this is the current framework that we're going to look at tonight. And it's something that should be used for the majority of athletes. So we can see here that we have even fit for life or active for life, but we also have train to win. So highly competitive athletes, but then we also have the group of individuals who are maybe just, you know, being active for life. So kind of breaking it down for you, kids and adults are going to get active at some point in their life. We hope that they stay active and maybe they reach a, you know, peak sport achievement. And that's going to be if they do the right things at the right time. And so that's what the LTAD is there to do, is to help this framework so that we understand development of athletes and where they should be at based around some parameters. So if we look to the bottom right of the model. So first, contact or awareness. So basically, people need to be aware that there's activities for them to get into. So the first involvement is going to be that first experience that the participant has in sport. It's critical to ensure, obviously, that individuals have a positive first experience in activity. And so when we talk about the active start and fundamentals, you'll see that it's at a very young age. So we want to make sure that it's a positive first experience so that they come back and participate. As we do know in sport, as a negative experience could lead to them ceasing activity, which we don't want. So organizations and leaders, we want to create this safe, welcoming, inclusive environment where participants feel that the instruction is developmentally appropriate, that the equipment is appropriate, facilities have, the appropriate programming, and obviously we want to create confidence and participation for life in sport. And that's our goal, Louise. So we're going to kind of just look through the rest of the framework here as we look up. So the active start. So if you look at the age, now these are going to be broad. So it's not necessarily only till 6 years old. And you'll see as we go on, the age changes. It's going to be dependent on development, maturity, things like that. So to just understand the framework, active start is going to be, say, from birth to 6 years old. So think about what you would put your children in at a young age. So there's obviously going to be things like swimming lessons or gymnastics, or you sometimes see some young soccer. So sport itself here should be fun, right? So these activities are going to be fun. It's going to essentially create movement for the children, daily physical activity, but the emphasis isn't going to be on physical activity. It's going to be on that it's fun. It's essentially non-competitive at this point. It's more games, just movement through games, unstructured versus a structured environment here typically. And it's going to be a part of the routine, okay? So when we get older, we start to see a recommended amount of activity, but here it's just that you want it to have a social aspect, and it's going to focus on just getting the kids active, essentially. So not really focused on sport here. Again, just small children looking to get them active into some type of fun environment. So if we move up to fundamentals, obviously a little bit play on words there. So it says fundamentals for a reason, fun being highlighted here. There's going to be some fundamental movement skills that are developed in this phase. And again, we see that age approximately 6 to 9 years old. And it's still going to be unstructured. Some of it will be more structured. So again, the focus is still on it being fun. Because I want you to think about, even as adults, why do we choose to participate in physical activity or exercise? Most times we're going to choose things that are fun and that we enjoy. Now, I know not everybody enjoys exercise, but predominantly we're going to try to choose things that are fun and that we enjoy. So remembering that even at this young age of 6 to 9 years old. So again, some of it's going to start to be a little bit more structured. There might be a little bit more instruction here, but again, we want to give them the imagination piece. We want them to create their own fun here. We start to encourage, obviously, like running, jumping, throwing, catching, swimming, but you'll notice that all movements at this age are still going to be body weight. So again, we're not at this point still going to add an external load. There might be some rules or etiquette of sport that are introduced here, focusing on fair play, respect for others. But from a sense of in the weight room, there's going to be, sense of periodization or essentially structure around, again, the movements that they're going to be doing. So as we move up to learn to train, we see it's approximately 9 to that adolescent growth spurt. So that's going to be different. And so there's really no age that we can say that starts or ends at. But again, in this learn to train, you're going to see that we're understanding basic rules, there's tactics, strategies, and games, things like that. And then opportunities to participate in multi-sports with competition is typically here. So we see like U10 soccer, hockey, So we start to see a little bit of competition happening. Games and activities are still fun, but we start to see a little bit more skill coming in. So skill-based activities. So in terms of the weight room, we might start to introduce some things, still probably body weight to begin with, depending on you know, their physical literacy of what they're able to do up until that growth spurt starts. So then when we get kind of, we're going to shift to the left if you're looking at the screen. When we shift kind of to the left here, it's train to train. So this is that 11 to 16 years old. Now, again, these age ranges that they've put on here, you're going to see that this is essentially just that transition from maybe being a young adolescent into a young adult. And so this is where we will typically start to see progression within their sport. Okay, so if you think of a 15-year-old probably picking or specializing or starting to see that they are better or more skilled in a sport, there is a huge emphasis in the train to train section on development and retention of athletes. And this is where it's important. So we typically see dropout in sport happen around this age. So, you know, they've maybe played in middle school at the high school level, and then they move into high school, and then they sometimes drop off. And so we either see that, and they might move into the active for life or fit for life, or they will continue to go up on this left side, which you can see in the white, it says excellence. So we start to move up in terms of competitiveness of the sport. So this is where in the weight room, we will start to integrate free weights. We will start to obviously teach technique. We're going to build a lot more structure than you've seen typically with the other stages up until this point. Again, it wasn't super structured. There wasn't a formalized training plan that needed to be followed, but you will start to see it here. And you'll see formalized competitions. This is where you'll start to see standings. Oh dear. So I think it's just important to note here that if they don't move from train to train to compete, it's not a bad thing, but this is where we will start to see the athletes start to pick up more training. So that's what we're talking about in terms of the weight room. So this is where we start to see a higher emphasis put on that. So I put this in here to interrupt our regular programming because there's more obviously to our image that I haven't gotten to. But I think it's important that we understand where these age ranges are and why they're there and why the LTAD exists and why it's a framework for us in the weight room to understand it. We want to look at what's developmentally appropriate training for the athletes. And I think that this is something that can be oversight in some ways. We want to be aware of when we can start to increase that structure, increase the duration, the volume, the intensity of training, when we can start to progress things. Adding too much structure too soon can create this fatigue of learning, right? Because there's going to be a ton that they need to learn in the weight room, which we talk about later on in terms of programming. So I think it's interesting when we look at sport, and we need to understand each sport. So gymnastics might be vastly different than hockey in terms of the developmental age at which they need to be participating in certain events. Figure skating is another one where we see it predominantly at a younger age. So I think we need to just understand as strength coaches what's developmentally appropriate for the athletes that we have in the room, and understanding the framework and how to use it to place our athletes on how we should be training them and what we should be doing with them at certain points. And so when you're coaching youth and varsity to some extent, we need to realize the importance early on that we're going to foster this lifelong positive association with exercise and a love for sport, not the opposite, right? So we don't want to create this negative aspect around lifting weights or going to their sport because it became too structured for them. So if I go back to the LTAD framework and move up to the train to compete, this is where we start to see a little bit more specialization in coaching staff. So not just mom or dad standing on the sideline coaching the, U8 soccer, but it's more of a specialized coaching. It's a very specialized training environment. It's very structured, it's scheduled. We see this significant shift towards the emphasis of training and testing and monitoring the athletic progression. So obviously we start to implement a whole lot more, and you'll see the age here I said is dependent on sport, which I mentioned in the previous slide about kind of understanding the sport at which the athlete's competing in, so that we know when they hit this stage in their training regime. So then we get to train to win, which looks like it's the top, right? So this is obviously the highest level of sports. It's international competition. The emphasis is on high performance. It's a highly specialized environment. And typically, like I said, we see the focus move to a single sport. So we see them predominantly just focusing on one sport, and Train to Win doesn't have an age attached to it, but we can essentially probably figure out for each sport where this starts to happen and when they start to take this path to the Train to Win. And then obviously, you will see that then obviously we want them to go into being active for life. So that is obviously the goal, like I said, lifelong enjoyment. Most people who train to win will be active for life. They've built a solid foundation in the first 3 stages of the excellence framework. They progress to maybe playing sport or sports of their choice in an enjoyment, recreational fashion. Obviously, there's health benefits that they obtain and they recognize that. And then some will continue to compete in organized sport while others may not. So I think it's just important for us to see the transition from, the first contact of how we make athletes aware at that young age, but that we don't force, which we see a lot, that the transition moving up is very clear as to what the expectation is of the athlete and what we should be doing with them essentially in the weight room. So I've kind of quickly gone through the framework and the image that you will see there for the LTAD model. And I thought it was super important that we understand that so that we can kind of understand where the rest of this presentation goes for the backbone, right? So again, you'll hear me talk about varsity athletes, but it also can, be applicable for high school athletes and young athletes who are in this path of Train to Win. So essentially, the big question you're waiting for is, who is the year-long athlete? And I'm sure that you can define this for yourself, but I think we need to understand if the athlete is competing year-round, how many competitive sports maybe do they play in? So this would be, that high school athlete who plays football, maybe they play basketball, volleyball, track and field, badminton, they like to do it all. And so inside school and out of school. And we've seen this shift towards more club teams and rep teams outside of the school system. And so kind of understanding what every activity is that athlete is participating in at this point. So do they specialize in one sport? So have they already chosen to only compete in one sport? Or do they kind of move all the way around and they're competing at all times of the year? I think the reason you want to know that is because if the answer is yes, and if they are going to be training for all different sports, what's the demand on the athlete year round, and what is it that they're going to be focusing on in the weight room if they're playing one sport? So there's been many presentations that you're going to hear me reference that happened previous to mine. And I think it's important, again, that everything that's been presented on can kind of tie it into tonight's, in terms of understanding everything that goes into training the athlete. So in terms of strength conditioning, so again, try to remember we're focusing on things that are happening in the weight room. And so essentially we look at a typical week. And so this is, I'll use the example if we have one of our ASDC AEP athletes who is potentially a multi-sport athlete. they participate in 4 sports, we need to understand kind of what's happening in a typical week. So what are they already doing before they get into the weight room? So we look at a typical week, we kind of see what organized training they're a part of. So again, we're assuming that they're in the train to compete phase at this point, maybe the train to win if they're varsity. So what are they already doing in a team environment, maybe an individual environment? And then we have to ask if they're doing private sport sessions or lessons. So for example, tennis, they might have tennis practice, but then they also might have a private session that works on something different. Okay, so understanding the amount of time that goes into the athlete in a week, which is the second section there. You can see how many hours a week. And this would all be before you add strength conditioning to a youth athlete's schedule. And how long is each session? I think we have this assumption that every session is the same length. So understanding the amount of time, the hours in a week and a day that the athlete is being active. And then obviously how much rest between sessions. And this is important. I think at the very end of my presentation, I briefly touch on recovery, but obviously we need to understand how much activity is happening in a week or in a day potentially. And then I already mentioned this, but in season. So is our athlete in season for any of their sports? So if they predominantly like to play hockey and specialize in hockey, but they play badminton and they're in season for badminton, would their training look different? And if yes, how does that change your plan in the weight room for that particular athlete? Again, depending on developmentally where they're at and how we would approach their training program. Communication. So there was a whole topic on communication. So I just have one quick slide because I think that this is the foundation on which strength conditioning can either be successful or not. And I think here you see I have communication with the athlete kind of starred. So that's number one. And I think it's essential to create and foster a relationship and trust between the athlete and the strength coach. So, having this is going to allow the athlete to tell you what's really going on, and that's going to help create this daily dialogue or even weekly, getting them to open up. That's overall going to help you maximize their performance. So if we think about a couple sessions ago, Larry talked about monitoring, testing, and when it was appropriate. And I think monitoring is something that we need to do a lot more of in the weight room in terms of just monitoring daily things within the athlete so that we can understand a little bit more of what's going on, because otherwise, otherwise, if we don't understand what's going on with the athlete and we just have a plan in our head and we go to execute it and the athlete is fatigued, you're not going to get, that maximized performance that you're looking for. And in fact, you could also potentially injure the athlete, or it could be at the detriment of their sport. Okay, so remembering strength conditioning is always an extra, it's always added on top of potentially 3-4 practices a week. So looking at how it kind of goes with that, which is why communication with the sport coach comes right after. And I wouldn't say it's any less important, if not more important, than communication with the athlete. So again, in the environment where maybe the high school coach does both, or in an environment where you have a facility where there are strength coaches, the coach knows the athletes and works with the athletes the most. And I think that it's so important to create that communication chain from sport coach to strength coach and allow it to be a two-way street so that it is that daily communication. I think the biggest threat to strength conditioning can be if it becomes siloed from the actual sport itself. And you will see that it will not be successful if both are not planned together and collectively working towards the same goal, which is obviously to have excellence within the sport in which the athlete is playing and the coach is coaching. So communication is huge here with the athlete, obviously, and we have seen in previous presentations, like monitoring sheets, and so creating that communication so that they feel comfortable sharing that information, and then with the sport coach. And then if applicable, I put in obviously communication with parents. This is going to be key, learning to talk to parents, say if you're training with a youth environment, because they're going to ask questions and you need to understand why the parent is questioning things, and they're going to want to know the why. And so we need to be able to understand the LTD framework and then be able to say, this is why we're doing X with your athlete. We hear tons, I think my kid needs X. And so we're going to take that in consideration, and obviously understanding where the plan for the sport excellence is going to go within the LTD model if they're youth. But communicating that with the parent is going to be huge, so that they also understand why you're doing what you're doing in the weight room, because the parent obviously controls that the kid is coming to you and is adding strength conditioning to their sport. So we want to make sure that we are communicating with all three and making sure that the communication is open and that the dialogue is clear and that we all understand what is expected of each other in that situation. So we hear a lot about, you know, athlete specific training, and so the next couple slides are going to be kind of taking us through you know, what it is that the nuts and bolts of weight training. And so when we talked about the LTD framework and I talked about that youth group that's going to be that, like, say 9 to 16-year-old, depending on where they're at or when that growth spurt happens, is going to be dependent on what you're going to want to do in the weight room. And we sometimes see too much too soon, or too much all at once. And when we look at what, you know, the athlete specific training should be, you have to look at the sport. And so when it's a multi-sport athlete potentially, and they have 4 sports that they play, we want to just break it down and look at the basics. And at the end of the day, when we're training athletes, there's components of fitness and components of sport that we're going to look at. But in my mind, we can keep things simple. And I think that it's an opportunity for strength coaches not to overcomplicate the basics of training and things that work. Unfortunately, our industry, there's a giant thing called the internet, and you can find a lot of information, and you need to find what is the good information or excellent information or legit information versus things that maybe aren't needed in terms of athlete specific training. And so you'll see here on the screen, there's faster, stronger, powerful, explosive. You're going to see those come up again in a couple slides. You know, what about balance and coordination? So when we talked about that small, you know, learning to train, we talked about just like simple, you know, running, throwing, jumping, swimming, just movement. And so we don't want to overcomplicate things. And I think that's where I said, don't forget what happens physiologically when we play sport, and in a structured environment, but also in an unstructured environment. And so to, you know, work on becoming faster or more agile, it doesn't always have to be, you know, an agility ladder on the floor. There's 100 other things that happen while you're playing sport that are actually working on that without maybe even the athletes or the youth players knowing that. And so when I say don't overcomplicate things, it's, you know, the squat, lunge, hinge, push, pull theory, you know, and then obviously looking at being power, explosive, strong, fast, speedy. We hear these terms, and they all happen in the weight room, and we can focus on them in the weight room, but predominantly we see a lot of the adaptations happening to the athletes when they're actually playing the sports that they're playing. So how do we figure out what the needs of the athletes are? So we've got, you know, who they are. We've got that we're going to communicate and monitor with them. We, you know that there's this athlete specific training that we're going to do that's, you know, specific to that person and where they're at in the LTD framework. And so this needs analysis is really simple. I can be really simple. So basically, if you start on the left hand side in the blue square, the needs of the sport. So you need to understand the sport, and you need to understand what the needs of the sport are, and that's going to be, physiological and biomechanical. And that's basically you understanding, what is going to happen with this athlete and how you can enhance their performance in the weight room. If you move straight across to best performers, this is, I'm going to say, more so for the train to win section of the LTD model. We would look at that normative data. We would look at who is the best performers, and this is where you would start to see rankings or standings. You could look at the current status of an athlete on maybe an international level, depending on their sport and where they're competing at. And how you can compare the data across the board. But I think we want to urge against this. We definitely don't want to take a bantam hockey player and compare them to the NHL combine tests. So I urge against that. Goals. This is where, in the needs analysis piece, we're going to start to bridge the gap between essentially what the goals are of the athlete, what the athlete is capable of completing, so we can identify the resources that they're going to need. And the goals, I think this term is overused. I think people think, I just have to set a short-term and a long-term goal, and that's not really what this is saying. I think it's more so saying, looking at where the athlete is at in terms of development, looking at how we can create, an excellence plan in terms of their sport in the weight room. But this is also a team effort, and not naive to the fact that it does take a team. And so at the varsity level or at the elite level, we see things like mental performance coaches, we see strength coaches, physios, massage, all of this stuff coming together, and all of those goals are going to be obviously for the athletic excellence of the athlete in their current sport. And then the timeline. So timelines change, and this is not something that is written in Sharpie. I always say write it in pencil because they will change. You are going to create a plan, and this plan is just that. It's just a plan, and you're going to follow it, but there's going to be lots of opportunity for changes, and this is going to include training programs. It's going to include maybe when you're going to test and measure progress. There's many avenues you can take there in terms of measuring that. Practices, competitions, say deload weeks when we're going to deload the athletes, maybe when they take some time off. So basically we understand the sport, we understand kind of the best of the best. We take our athlete and the goals of that athlete, and then we create this timeline of how we're going to get there. And again, not just in the weight room, but kind of creating that larger picture of everybody that's going to be involved in it. So looking at very basic program design, like I said, I think program design could be 50 slides on its own, but this is essentially when we look at the train-to-train model. So when we have these younger athletes in our space, how do we go about creating a program for them, and what essentially goes into it? And so step one is exercise mode. So this is just what you're going to be doing. Are you lifting, sprinting? Are you focusing purely on technique? Is it like just a learning session? Jumping, running, whatever it is. So you're going to pick what it is that the goal of that session is. And then you're going to obviously decide the training frequency, and frequency is going to change sport to sport. It's going to change in season or out of season. So we get a little bit more into that in a couple slides, but just understanding how many days essentially in the weight room for this program you're going to be doing it. So is it 2 days for 5 days a week, or is it only 3 days a week for an hour? But just understanding kind of what you're doing and then how often you're going to do it. Intensity, I think this is one, again, that can be overlooked. Not all training sessions need to be a 10 out of 10, regardless, the fact that the intensity seems to always need to be high. If we use a rate of perceived exertion scale, so a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being rest, 10 being very hard, we want to gauge where our intensity for every session is at, and this is going to be dependent on what you're doing, how often you're doing it, and potentially, are you in season, out of season again? And we want to make sure that each goal of each session, if you have an RPE, that you ask the athlete on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, how intense was this session, is an easy verbal cue to get them to start thinking about the intensity. Obviously, other ways you can think of intensity would be measuring with heart rate. So then duration, you could say, is largely related to intensity. So the more intense a session, the duration may go down. So often we see, you know, 60-minute workout blocks, but you can definitely do an effective training in not 60 minutes. It doesn't have to be 60 minutes. It might be 30 minutes. It depends on what you're doing, again, and the goal of the session, and making sure that you do everything you need to do in that duration. And then number 5, exercise progression. So this is where you're going to focus on each athlete and where they're at and how you're going to progress them to, say, the next phase. And so not all athletes are going to progress at the same rate, just like not all teenagers mature at the same rate. So we need to be aware of this in the weight room and not just you know, block everybody as a progression and say, okay, now that you've done X, you can move on to Y. That might not be the case, but we're obviously looking for a training adaptation. So in the weight room, we're looking for something. And so what is it that we're looking for out of that training session, and how long? So again, depending on how many weeks you're doing it for, and this is where obviously periodization comes in, and then you would progress beyond obviously that program. For a multi-sport program that we run, typically it's 10 weeks. We would see things change in that 10 weeks. They wouldn't necessarily do the same things for all 10 weeks, but again, it depends on if it's, you know, something where we're just teaching them how to lift, so it's just purely technique and we talk a lot and they listen a lot. So depending on the intensities of these sessions, that's going to be how we would progress like a multi-sport athlete in our weight room, say, that's coming to us for 10 weeks straight. So I can't emphasize this enough. So I think it goes back to the slide I said when I said it needed to be developmentally appropriate. Quality is key. And in the weight room, it always needs to be quality movements, quality training programs, and quality sessions. And the formula for that obviously is going to be dependent on the athlete, depends on the age, the ability of the athlete, obviously, that we have in front of us. And again, now that we can understand the LTD framework, I think, you know, we can maybe place them and train them accordingly versus them walking in our room, us having a workout in our head or on the whiteboard. We're famous for having whiteboards, and just expecting them to be able to do it. You know, it needs to be safe, well executed. And I think that that's something that should be at the top of the list and the top of the priority for all strength coaches, especially working with that youth population, and making sure that everything obviously in the weight room needs to be safe, well executed. You know, we never want to create injury and always avoid injury. So making sure that the quality of both movement is there with the athlete and the quality of the training program, you know, goes with that. And it kind of goes without saying, but you'd be shocked at some things that happen in the weight room. So now what? You have all this information, you know who the athlete is, you know they're a multi-sport athlete, you know where they're at in the LTD framework. And so, you know, making each workout essentially has some basic components. I think, you know, we want to look at, are they preseason, are they in season, postseason, and off season? And this is going to look very different for each sport. So I will try to illustrate what it would look like for a sport and then see if you could relate it to the sport in which maybe the athlete is in. So, you know, how can we take a team program essentially and individualize it based on preseason? Now preseason, you might see a ton of exhibition series, you might see training camps, you might see some testing happening in preseason. So what is training going to look like? And again, that frequency, intensity, duration might change between preseason and in season. If this athlete is in season, you're typically going to see, you know, the technical training go up for their sport. So that's going to be predominantly what they're working on. And then, you know, strength conditioning is coming secondary in season. You know, the athletes, again, are not working at an intensity, you know, that's super high because their sport intensity is going to be high. Postseason looks different. This could be, you know, playoffs, it could be national championships. Postseason could also mean, you know, after everything has wrapped up, and are they taking a break? Is there a hiatus from training? You know, it's important, I think, to take those breaks, you know, see some recovery periods. Again, depending on the demands of the sport, it's going to be very different. But we typically shine in the off season. So depending on the coach and the athletes, the off season, you'll typically see strength conditioning increase and the technical sport part of their training decrease. So, you know, programming workouts effectively, you know, in the train to compete and train to win category is going to be dependent on, again, they're going to be one sport athletes. It's going to be dependent on what season they're in. You know, if they're the multi-sport athletes, you know, we want to remember that if they're in season for a sport, training might look different in terms of intensity and duration than someone who's truly in an off season and someone who truly is, you know, not competing at a higher level in their sport. So then, you know, making the workout, like I said, it has some very basic components, and I say basic, but they're very important. So warming up athletes appropriately for what they're doing. And we see a lot of blanket warm-ups out there, but I think it's important that the athletes understand what an effective warm-up looks like versus what sitting on a foam roller texting their friends looks like. So you need to keep it simple, but I also want to keep it interesting here. So we want to engage the athletes and prepare them for what they're going to do. So not every warm-up might look the same, but it's going to prepare the athlete for what they're about to do in the weight room. And your workout is really only going to be as effective as your warm-up is. Athletes who roll in and load the bar up and go to squat, chances of injury is going to increase exponentially. So we want to make sure that they understand and value what an effective warm-up should look like and can look like. The primary workout is essentially just the body, so that's what the main focus of the session is. So that goal we talked about for every session, looking at essentially what are we trying to accomplish in the workout, right? So there's going to be a goal for every session, and that's going to be what the primary workout, you know, is comprised of. So if the focus is speed, obviously we're going to have, you know, maybe some teaching, some technique pieces, but then there's going to be, you know, speed focused drills happening. And then finally, the effective cool down. Again, effective being the key word here. We all know the benefits of effectively cooling down. Again, not just sitting down and laying on the floor, but often what athletes will do. And we want to emphasize that recovery starts as soon as the training session ends. So how can we start to effectively cool them down? How can we encourage them that, you know, their recovery needs to be, you know, taken seriously? You know, this is things that involve stretching, but it's not just stretching, it's, you know, the ice baths, bike flushes, and many other things, again, that I get to, and I think about 2 slides that go into recovery and being, you know, maximal effectiveness at your performance. And we see that, you know, more is not always better in terms of the weight room. And so, you know, effectively cooling the athlete down, potentially if they've had a hard day, will be good in starting that cool down process and recovery process before their next training session. Again, depending on how many hours are going to be between their next training session, whether it's that same day in a practice or whether it's the next following day. So I kind of mentioned that I was going to come back to this, where we see all of these components of fitness, and, you know, we hear these things about, you know, speed, agility, quickness, mobility, explosive strength, whatever it is. So, you know, they're all athletic qualities that, you know, we want to require our athletes to, you know, have a high level of competitive sport. They need these. So I think that there's an analogy, and it's the bucket analogy, and we want to think about when we work on an athletic ability, we're pouring into that athletic bucket. And this is an analogy that comes from a strength coach down in the US, and we want to fill the buckets. And so we're going to pick the quality, the athletic development quality that we're going to work on, and then we're going to fill it. And I think what happens is we want to allocate our resources and training time across all of them all of the time, but we want to make sure that we're obviously picking the ones that the athletes need to be successful. So if I take you back slides where I said the needs of the sport, we want to make an effort in the weight room to increase a skill, which is a bucket, that transfers to their sport essentially. So, when we look at the LTD model and how we can relate it to this in the early stages of sport, it's more important that we focus on what we're teaching them to create that longevity in sport and participation. We're not here to tell the athlete that they're not fast enough or they're not strong enough, but that we want to obviously start to develop and see all of these qualities coming together. And the weight room, again, is not the only place that these are worked on, but you will see obviously strength coaches are going to be told, like, you need to make the athletes faster or you need to make the athletes stronger. And so we take these buckets and we fill these qualities. And I think we want to make sure, that the athletes aren't average at everything, and that it can be carried over to the field. So making sure that it's applicable to the sport. In terms of youth, I think it's really important that we look at everything when we get up more into the train to win components at the excellence level. We want to look at obviously how we're taking these components and periodizing them in their programming and looking at the demands of the sport and how we're using them. And sometimes I think we need to be reminded in the weight room, you can do less better. So it doesn't always have to be more. We don't always have to have 2-hour training sessions, and we don't need to do more in terms of work capacity, but they need to be better at what they are, actually doing. So there's an image here, and I found it really interesting and I wanted to share it. So I think it's really important that we look at the big picture. And I mentioned the team. I mentioned the sport performance coach. I mentioned the mental performance coach. I mentioned physio, athletic therapy, massage, whatever it is. So we get told this a lot, like your job, in the weight room is to make the athletes fit. And this is troubling in the sense that if you look at what says my responsibility, so that would be in the weight room, we're looking for physiological adaptation, okay? So we wanting to get stronger, faster, jump higher, but we're often looked at, where we can't get the athlete to be fit. And I think when we talk about performance, or being fit, we want them to understand this big picture. And there's just a few things around there that you can look at. And this doesn't just happen in the weight room. And these aren't controllables that happen in the weight room. And there's a ton of factors that are listed. You can see this. And so when we talk about recovery, what about nutrition and hydration, which you see on the bottom there? It's two large factors that are going to affect performance, and it's actually going to affect their performance in the weight room too, not just in their sport. But these aren't controlled by a strength coach, and they're not controlled in the weight room. At least I would argue that they're not. So we need to start to see that there's many things that go into being quote unquote fit, and it's not always a case of adding more workloads or running more sets of stairs or increasing the workload. It's just making sure, again, I said, do better at less, and be effective at what you're doing. And if it's not working, go back to the drawing board and change it. But I think at this point, if I look at varsity athletics, putting some accountability back, onto the athlete to see, are they getting enough sleep? And I can guarantee the answer is no. Are they monitoring their sleep? Is that something that, daily they are writing down so they can see trends, or reporting on their sleep quality? Maybe they didn't sleep very well. They had a hard training session the day before. So coming into the weight room, are they really going to be ready to train? What is their readiness to train going to be? We also need to be really cognizant of stressors. So we look at school as a stress, maybe social stress, traveling, all of these things that will compound on these athletes that we might not realize. We might have essentially the best training plan written down, but if we're not managing all of these other things, we can start to see the performance decrease. But again, not all controlled in the weight room at all. And so I think making athletes understand, to create good routines, and giving time for adaptations to happen, or reflecting on what didn't work for them. I think that's also really important, self-reflection. And that's where I think that monitoring and that daily dialogue for them is important, so they can reflect on what didn't work for them. And as a coaching staff, we can be patient and, preach consistency to them, process that self-evaluation piece, but we also need to do that with ourselves in our programs, and what are we doing to help with the athletes? And then obviously how compliant, to a program was the athlete. So we hear it, oh, it didn't work. Well, did you do it once a week and it was supposed to be done 5 times a week? And this is where monitoring and testing, comes in, right? So we can see those adaptations that we're looking for, and we can test for them and see data, and show data on, what it is that we were actually looking for. So I always find it really interesting when people, broadly say we're not fit, but in fact, when we're looking at what's happening in the weight room, especially with adolescents who are growing, and again, they're going to school and they're doing all of these things, are they controlling all these other factors that would go into helping their performance? So I said I would get to recovery. So, obviously we know that the body needs sleep. We know the body needs recovery, essentially to thrive. And so performance, when we look at performance in the weight room and in their sport, we need to understand kind of how that fatigue will happen. And so training stress comes, from a variety of sources on these athletes. It comes on the field, on the courts, in the pool, wherever they're at. There's also the physical training side of it. I talked about the external stressors that maybe we aren't in control of, and then managing all of it. And again, depending on the sport and develop the resources that are potentially available to them. But how can we start to facilitate proper recovery and manage their weekly schedule, the weekly intensities that I talked about? So if practice is really intense, is the weight room also going to be really intense? And how can we prepare the athletes for that? And again, managing how much work is being done. And this is going to be that communication between the athlete and the coach, and the coach and the strength coach, and making sure that everybody understands if one person thinks recovery is happening and it's not, how can we facilitate this as a coaching staff? And looking at the difference between mental exhaustion and physical exhaustion. And we hear the word burnout, right? We hear that, what leads to burnout, is too much training stress coupled with too little recovery. But remembering that's not just time between training sessions. Again, is the nutrition proper, is the hydration, there's other factors obviously that are starting to go into that recovery process. And so understanding essentially how we're facilitating this, and again, at the youth level, probably different than at a varsity level where they're adults, or we hope that they can help facilitate that. But I think it's super important that we understand and we start to preach what recovery does for the body, and how it essentially helps their overall performance, and they will perform better if they're properly recovered and their readiness to train, is high. So I think the key points that I kind of want to wrap up with is, looking at how training is structured or unstructured, right? So if we look at the fundamental stage, if it's just general and we're just getting movement and we're getting them excited about movement, versus if it's, that athlete specific. So we, have a very specific goal that we're looking to get, what organized training looks like. So periodization, the sense of direction and how we're periodizing, that physiological adaptation that we're looking for. Randomized training is probably not going to provide that long-term athletic result, if there isn't some type of appropriate periodization and progression within the athletic development of the athlete throughout the years. We want to just aim to promote long-term training, health and performance. And I think that those are things that we need to continue to remember. An injured athlete is not a competing athlete. And so keeping them healthy, keeping them performing, and then the longevity, right? So after sport, what happens to them after sport? So I think, keeping things enjoyable, is important. Obviously there's work to be done in the weight room, but making sure it's enjoyable, and then evaluating. We need to reevaluate and change what we're doing, and see if it's working. And I say this, a sound program should incorporate all types of training into the athlete's weekly, monthly, yearly training schedule, making a YTP, but understanding how you're evaluating that and how you're changing that and evolving it depending on the athlete that you have in front of you, who they are, what they're doing, what their current status is. So, I think, it all comes together at the end of the day that in the weight room, we are looking to enhance performance, and we're looking to have a positive experience in youth in terms of successful and them staying in sport and that longevity. And then obviously, hopefully being active for life. And so just tying everything back that we do in the weight room to just making sure that we're following all of that framework and understanding, where we're going with it and that it's not random. So that is all that I have at this point. So I do have time for questions. I apologize, it's 8:03 and I probably talked fast through lots of it, but was there any questions that came up throughout the presentation?
We just got one here. With more and more gyms being pressured to program for younger and younger athletes, how do you deal with parents and athletes when they would be better served perhaps doing less specialization and training in the weight room, not more?
So how would I deal with that? I think, honestly, it comes down, unfortunately, to the education at that youth level of them understanding what is going to be more beneficial to their sport. And I think that parents and youth alike, with all, like you said, all of these more programs that are becoming available to them, they feel this pressure that in order to specialize and excel within their sport, they have to do more, and they need to be signed up into every sport academy, and they need to be signed up into every off-season training program. And I'll pick on hockey for a second. We have spring hockey, summer hockey, tournament hockey, winter hockey. And now you've got, all these hockey programs that run year round. And so I think it, unfortunately, is an education piece. And I'm not sure the most effective way to communicate or educate to the parent at that level, at that age. It's going to be the parent that you need to understand, what is better in terms of athlete longevity. So making sure that their athlete can compete potentially at a high level for a long time. And unfortunately, I think with early specialization, we actually see the enjoyment level and the quote unquote burnout happen quicker because they're forced into their specialized sport sooner. And by the time they are an adult, they actually no longer enjoy their sport. But to circle back, I think it would be, unfortunately, like the education piece around what kids actually need right now. And I talked about the internet, and unfortunately, it's not in our favor. It's telling them that they need to do more. Does that answer the question?
Another question for you. Do you have an open and transparent relationship with the athletes regarding their controllables? And is this tough to communicate?
Yes. It's very tough to communicate, and it's very tough, I think, to talk on their level so that they can understand what they do control versus what maybe they don't think that they can control. But I encourage that open dialogue, and I think it comes from trust. And I say that because if the athlete doesn't trust you, they're really not going to open up and tell you vulnerable information. But we need to understand that as a coaching staff. And again, I'll circle back. If we can get them to kind of open up, and whether it's a monitoring format, whether it's not verbal, maybe they don't want to tell you, but somehow that they can record it. But to talk about what they can control, I would say it depends on the level of the athlete, but yes, I think just creating that trust and relationship so that they're willing to talk to you.
Okay, another one. What are some strategies you use to align your program / ideas with what the coach is wanting to do?
Yeah, so I think it's really important at the level that I work in predominantly that it is the coach understands obviously the importance of strength conditioning, but that the strength conditioning coach doesn't become siloed in their own head thinking that they know more about what is needed for the athletes. And so I think it is just that communication, and it has to be open and fluid, and not necessarily one telling the other what's right or wrong, but I would say it's way more of a collaboration nowadays, and just having the coach understand what the strength coach's role is, but then also understanding what they're doing in the weight room. If the coach doesn't know, and the athletes show up really sore, they're automatically going to say, okay, well, dang, what did they do in the weight room? So I think it needs to be very transparent about what both parties want out of strength conditioning and what their athletes are getting out of strength conditioning. And again, that's going to be that's going to start with the relationship between the coach and the strength coach, and then obviously not becoming siloed in two different areas, but rather collaborating on this is the needs and this is how we're going to go after it, and then creating that yearly training plan on a level that both understand the goal of the strength conditioning sessions.
Okay, that looks like all of our questions for tonight. Thank you, Heidi, for your presentation tonight. And this is our final session of the season. Want to thank all our coaches, in addition to Heidi, Josh, and Scott for their presentations. And thank everybody that participated. It was a privilege for Pronghorn Athletics and ASDC Southwest to bring you the coaching development series. Thank you, everybody.